Welcome to another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard, and today we are continuing our series with Hegel. I changed things. I changed what I thought I did, and I forgot to do the name at the bottom of the screen here. Whoops! Learning Hegel with Dr. Sadler. Yeah. Okay. Welcome back for real, for real. Okay. So gonna jump into it. Um, Let me see here. The last section we talked about, sections 67 through 68 of the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit. I said, Hegel shows us why philosophy should be treated as a serious business, lest it fall into argumentative, like debate bros, or conceit, like thought leaders, where there is no rigor or dialectic to build a strong foundation of knowledge. Dr. Sadler also seems to almost vent his observations of how people, even to this day, treat philosophy as something anybody can do with little to no effort, like the person who deems themselves a cook after watching a few cooking shows or buying a cookbook. Reading a few articles and thinking a bit on your own about subjects does not make you a philosopher. Hegel asserts that you must respect, analyze, and incorporate the entire history of philosophical thinkers and development in order to engage in the subject. Furthermore, you cannot be a genius of philosophy. That is, you cannot depend on blind intuition or common sense to make philosophical statements because you'll get nothing substantial from it. Philosophy is a laborious process of dialectics, history, and much more. Yeah, so that helps me, kind of jog my memory. But let's see what Dr. Sattler said here in his summary of the last section. He says, in these paragraphs, Hegel addresses common hold on. Some common misconceptions about philosophy, namely that by contrast to every other discipline, art, or inquiry, which require training and practice, philosophy can be easily acquired and done by anyone. Instead, what is required is a long, laborious, but intrinsically worthwhile process of culture, not appeals to intuitive revelations or good old common sense. Least of all is genius, something that we ought to look for, ought to that we ought to look to for guidance in philosophy. Yeah. So basically, what I said too. So we were right on subject with that one, um, right in tandem. So let's get started on this next section. Okay, here we go.
On the other hand, when philosophizing by the light of nature flows along the more even course of sound common sense, it offers, at its very best, only a rhetoric of trivial truths. And if reproached with the insignificance of these truths, it assures us in reply that their meaning and fulfillment reside in its heart, and must surely be present in the hearts of others too, since it reckons to have said the last word once the innocence of the heart, the purity of conscience, and such like have been mentioned. These are ultimate truths to which no exception can be taken, and beyond which nothing more can be demanded. It is just the point, however, that the best should not remain in the recesses of what is inner, but should be brought out of these depths into the light of day. But it would be better by far to spare oneself the effort of bringing forth ultimate truths of that kind, for they have long since been available in catechisms or popular sayings, for example. It is not difficult to grasp such vague and misleading truths, or even to show that the mind in believing them is also aware of their very opposite. When it labors to extricate itself from the bewilderment this sets up, it falls into fresh contradictions and may very well burst out with the assertion that the question is settled, that so-and-so is the truth, and that the other views are sophistries. For sophistry is a slogan used by ordinary common sense against educated reason, just as the expression visionary dreaming sums up once and for all what philosophy means to those who are ignorant of it.
So before they continue, I just want to go on that first section. He talked about here. Remember, he's coming back, I believe, from I forget exactly where we left off last time in terms of the paragraphs, but on the other hand, when philosophizing by the light of nature flows along the more even course of sound common sense. It offers at its very best only a rhetoric of trivial truths, right? So, going back to what we were saying in the summary of how you can't really depend on just common sense or like a genius intuition to, do philosophy, right? Those things that you think are common sense aren't really common, right? Take freedom, for instance. I think Dr. Sadler talks about this in his last episode, but I've been thinking about this myself a lot recently, or for a while now. Is like, what do we mean by freedom, right? Like, people like to think that we have the common sense understanding of what freedom is, but if you just analyze or critique any person about what freedom actually means, you'll see very quickly that they don't really have a clear idea of what freedom actually means, right? And when they do say something about it, it often seems very surface level and in and of itself illogical in a way, right? Because people might say, oh, freedom means the ability to say my own choices, right? And then by the very same token, they'll be like, that's why I support abortion. Okay. I'm sorry, that's why I support anti-abortion, right? Like, that's why I'm pro what's the term, pro life, right? um but like you just said, freedom is the ability to do whatever you want, right? So if you don't let the woman have an abortion, why, how's that freedom, right? So it's like inconsistencies like this, you see this all over the political spectrum, right? And in that way, you see that the a common sense idea of freedom is not really common sense, and that intuition, that intuitive understanding of what this philosophy of freedom doesn't is not foundational enough, right? It's not uh, comprehensive enough to really give a good understanding of what freedom actually means and what that looks like. And so this is why, it's so important to have philosophy as a system of knowledge, as a foundational system of knowledge and all this other stuff. So I just wanted to touch on that because I think that's pretty powerful there. But let's continue up where we were.
Sets up, it falls into fresh contradictions and may very well burst out with the assertion
I
that
know
the
we did this
question is
part. Let's
settled,
just.
that so and so is the truth, and that the other views are sophistries. For sophistry is a slogan used by ordinary common sense against educated reason, just as the expression visionary dreaming sums up once and for all what philosophy means to those who are ignorant of it. Since the man of common sense makes this appeal to feeling, to an oracle within his breast, he is finished and done with anyone who does not agree. He has only to explain that he has nothing more to say to anyone who does not find and feel the same in himself. In other words, he tramples underfoot the roots of humanity.
Hmm.
For it is the nature of humanity to press onward to agreement with others. Human nature only really exists in an achieved community of minds.
Hmm.
The anti-human, the merely animal, consists in staying within the sphere of feeling and being able to communicate only at that level.
I think that's very powerful as well, right? Because all the time you'd love to hear this idea of what human nature is. Like, human nature is greedy or this, that, and the other. And if you've been watching my other, series talking about my own newsletter on this stuff, like, human nature is very adaptive. It depends. It's contextual, right? And I like what he says here. First, for it is the nature of humanity to press onward to agreement with others. Human nature only really exists in an achieved community of minds. And how I put that in my own, article is that human nature is social, right? And social relationships, being social is the process of just talking to one another, of just, trying to agree with others and doing things because you're in this community and believing in something because you're in this community, right? Um, and a large part of our intelligence as a species came from this social interaction, this interaction between two people or more, or a whole group of us. So this, you know, I just really like how he said this here. And this part too, with the anti-human, the merely animal, consists in staying within the sphere of feeling, right? Because as much as we like to say, oh, excuse me, I just want to say real quick, we like to kind of contrast feeling with logic, right? With emotion with logic. But really it's like feeling is kind of like the first level of logic. It's a signal telling you what you're feeling, what your experience is. The raw kind of data coming from your experience, your phenomenology, if you will. All right. So that's kind of like the basis. And then you're supposed to, as humans, we're supposed to take our feelings to try to communicate that with ourselves and with other people, to go a step beyond, to say, okay, what does this feeling mean, right? Like when a dog is hungry, they go and try to find food, right? What people don't understand about dogs is that, for instance, people think dogs keep track of time, or any pets keep track of time, because they're always, they know when feeding time is. But it's not actually that. They don't know about the time. It's an actual physiological cycle that goes on. Meaning, when they get fed at a certain time, right? When you establish a feeding time, that means their physiology, their hunger, right? Their happiness, their I don't want to say happiness, but their mood, right? All that kind of uh, moves up and down based on that feeding time. So if they eat at 6 o'clock, that's when their physiological body, like that's when their home hormones and all this other stuff will be at a level telling them that it's time to eat. Just like when you get hungry at a certain time, or at lunchtime or dinner time, or whatever, right? And you're like, oh, I'm hungry, right? That's what a dog feels. But they don't go beyond that, right? They're extremely in tune with that physiological feeling, so they can they know when it's 7 o'clock, when it's 7 o'clock, because they feel it very intensely. But for us, once we feel something, then we go a step beyond that. We try to figure out, okay, what can I do with this, information. um so to bring that back here, right? The merely animal consists in staying with the sphere of feeling. And this is really important, because in our current society, really, for a long time in our society, it becomes, it's in the interest of those in power, right? To give you this sense of feeling, right? To give you this feeling of being free, or being in a certain state of mind, so that you don't question things, right? And then this is not even a conspiratorial, way of saying this. Oh, people in power manipulate. Like, no, anybody will tell you that, yes, this is what power does. Like the whole aspect of power, of keeping in power, like a big part of that is making sure that people feel like they are in a good spot, regardless of the actual situation. If you make people feel like they, are part of the state, or part of the whatever that you're in, right? Whatever the community, if you will, right? Going to the last sentence, if you make people feel like they are part of that community, then they don't really question things, because they feel comfortable, they feel included, they feel um and a shared identity, and things like that. So I just wanted to touch on this, because this is something that is, we see a lot in today's time with social media, and how, the media often kind of portrays things in such a way that you feel a certain way about something, but you don't really critique it very much, right? And we say we're critiquing it, but really we're just reacting to how we're feeling, right? When you see a headline, you instantly react. You try to share it. You post. You oh no, this is not true. This is blah 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 blah. But by even if you're trying to correct the headline, right? You're just reacting to your feeling. You didn't take some time. Most of us don't really look at a headline and say, "Huh, let me do some research. Let me dive into this and dive into that, and look at this citations and look at these citations before we actually form an opinion." No, we form an opinion almost instantly, because that's how we feel, that's how we react, right? And so, yeah, I just wanted to touch on that, because this is, again, very important. Like, we're behaving like animals when we see a headline and just react to it. We're behaving like animals, like a simple animal, like a mere animal, if you will, because we're still animals either way. But we're behaving like an animal who doesn't have the ability to go beyond that sense of feeling, right? When we react instantly to that feeling. So, anyways, yeah, that just came to mind when I saw that. So I wanted to take some time with that. Let's
Within the
continue.
sphere of feeling and being able to communicate only at that level. The sound common sense that Hegel is criticizing in this section, and continuing on to criticize in the next section as we come to the end of the preface of the Phenomenology, is something that you could come up with synonyms for in our own time. We don't often use the term right thinking, although that was a common term in the last century. Right thinking means not necessarily thinking conservatively on the right, but thinking along the lines that a good, decent person would do.
Speed you up,
so
my
in
man.
our own contemporary society, there are versions of it where, you know, a person who's right-thinking thinks the way that somebody on the right or a conservative does. There's also all sorts of ways in which right-thinking is done from the perspective of the left. You know, things are simply taken for granted. And of course, you can find people on all sorts of other extremes doing that as well. Hegel is using the term common sense, and this was an idea that had become quite attractive in the century and a half or 2 centuries before he's writing the Phenomenology. Remember, we're separated from this work by about 200 years, and it's interesting because this is a work that is intensely critical of modernity, of, you know, the processes of modernization, but it also thinks that they're, in a certain sense, inescapable, that the world is been changed radically. And it's happened through things like the dissemination of newspapers, through the creation of what Jürgen Habermas has called the public sphere in his early work discussing that particular concept. And Hegel is really attuned to this. We're going to see him in the next section actually talking about how people can avoid doing philosophy by just getting, you know, the latest journals and newspapers. Now, that's something that's new. And what does this have to do with common sense? Well, you know, you might think of it as sort of a lowering of things to a certain common denominator so that communication can take place. And everybody can have some things more or less taken for granted. It's almost like having your own little cant or language that you communicate in, a culture or a milieu of ideas. And so going back to the right thinking idea, when you have such a milieu, there are right ways to think and there are wrong ways to think. And in the modern period, and we're going to see this getting played out in the Phenomenology, particularly in the later sections, as freedom is spreading, which is it's not a distinctively modern phenomenon, but the way in which freedom is spreading, Hegel thinks, is distinctively modern. The democratization, you could say, of freedom. As it's spreading, people are liberating themselves and their allegiances and their consciousness from previous forms of authority, from institutions to which they felt that they owed some deference. Now, what comes along to replace that? Well, you know, the Enlightenment and the whole modern movement of thought was, to say, reason. But reason by itself doesn't always get you where you want to go. We see Hegel criticize the philosophy of the understanding and how it ends up sort of in a type of skepticism almost, a futility. I can argue against anything. Well, what else could, you know, really satisfy what it is that we human beings need as intellectual creatures? Common sense. There you've got something that's a little bit humbler, but also more widespread. It reminds me of Descartes and his saying, he didn't actually believe this one bit when he said it, but it had great rhetorical force that, you know, good sense is so widely distributed. His evidence for that was nobody really asks for more than they already have. Now, that's not actually a good argument in favor of that assertion, but there is this notion that, look, you don't need to have studied philosophy or some other technical subject. You don't have to have undergone some sort of formation. You can just be a human being, and provided you can free yourself of your biases and, you know, pay attention to things with relatively clear eyes and connect up with your fellow human beings, you can make sense out of anything. As the English say, you can muddle through it. So the question is this common sense really adequate? And Hegel is looking at how do people actually reason along these lines? How do they think through it? So he says that it deploys a rhetoric of trivial truths. Now, when we hear the term rhetoric, we often don't think of everything that it comprises. In Hegel's day, rhetoric was still a subject that you would study. Why would you study it? Well, you know, in the Middle Ages, it was actually part of the trivium. And it degenerated. It became, you know, a formal subject that could be studied, but people were still using it. And the notion was that there was a tradition of inquiry, and it was primarily into figuring out, you know, certain figures of speech, commonplaces, how to get emotions involved, all those sorts of things. If you study Aristotle's Rhetoric, you'll see the beginnings of that study. Now, a rhetoric means a sort of array of things that you can say. So Cicero, great rhetorician, great theorist of rhetoric, said that what the rhetoric or the orator really needs is copia. That is, a abundance of things which they can talk about, you know, competently. Not necessarily at an expert level, but at least competently, you know, at least enough to get other people to buy into what it is that they're saying. So when we talk about a rhetoric in this sense, we don't just mean persuasion, we don't just mean rhetorical force, we mean having a bunch of commonplaces. Now, what are commonplaces? I should actually put that term up here. Trivial truths or commonplaces. Well, let's look at some contemporary ones. These are the things that you can use in argument or in discussion with people, which is still perhaps argument if you're trying to make claims and advance them and defend them, or consider the appropriateness of your you know, interlocutor's claims. You're really engaged in argument or reasoning together. It's all good. Now, that's a stupid thing that people say all the time, and you might say, well, you know, that's just a cliche. It doesn't have any meaning to it anymore. No, it actually does have a lot of meaning. It has a lot of force. Otherwise, people wouldn't be using it in reality shows to, you know, sort of stop conversations, to, you move the conversation to another place. It wouldn't be happening like that if it weren't a commonplace. Or, does the end really justify the means? That's always poses the question, and it's only asked in cases where the interlocutor is trying to claim that, no, in this case, the end, which is, supposed to be something good, does not justify the means, which is supposed to be something bad. So people make recourse to these all the time. Can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. Another cliche, another commonplace that people can relate to. Notice that these don't always have to be in the form of statements. They can be questions, they can be interjections, they can be all sorts of things. Just do it. They could be imperatives, right? Like the Nike campaign. Now, a rhetoric of trivial truths, these commonplaces, you can use them with people who are not particularly profound thinkers, people who are just going to operate according to common sense, because Hegel's saying that's more or less what common sense consists in, this kind of intertissue, this connectivity in language and in culture of all these different cliches and commonplaces. Now, when you push on that, and you say, well, what do you actually mean by this? When you play the part of Socrates, as he did in his own society, what happens? People often can't explain. I'm not quite sure what I did mean by that. What they do say is, well, I have the best intentions. I mean something good. You just have to go along with me. So there's an appeal to something common, something articulate, and then there is this sort of retreat inward. The meaning must reside in what Hegel calls the heart, die Herzen, right? And by that, what he means is internally to the person. It's in my intentions. It's in my mind. We don't have to necessarily pick heart with its romantic connotations. But the general idea is that a person who's saying these sorts of things, they more or less know what they mean. They're just having a hard time expressing it. And, that's because some things are difficult to express. But you just have to kind of feel your way into it. You have to feel what it is that they're saying. That's, a great slang expression. You feeling me? As opposed to, are you understanding what I'm saying to you? Are you feeling me? Are you having the same affective experience as I am, or as I want to portray you as having?
Yeah, this is a very interesting point here too, because like a lot of our understandings of truth, right, rely on this feeling, right, on this feeling of what we feel to be true or valid experiences and things like that. And I do think there's value there, right? Value in terms of how we experience life, like the fact that we can feel like, be like, oh, you feeling me? Yeah, I feel what you're getting at, even though I may not truly understand what you're getting at. I may feel it, because that allows a sense of empathy, right? That allows a sense of um uh, connection between your experience and my experience, and we can build that bridge and begin to, like, you know move from the same perspective, almost, right? Or at least move from the same understanding that we are human beings who share, experiences. But that does not mean that you are building a firm foundation, right, of knowledge. That does not mean you are building a shared sense of logic per se, right? You can feel somebody and learn something from that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're learning the right things, or learning, a comprehensive amount of things, or stuff like that. So yeah, I like this call out as well.
Now, what's the problem with
Oh,
this?
real
Well,
quick, like, I think he's probably gonna mention it here, but like when people say, "Oh, his intentions are good," right? Like, so I hear this all the time from certain people I know a lot, and what I love to tell them, or what I want to tell them, if I knew they had any sense of care about having an actual conversation, is that your intentions don't matter, right? Like, and you can have the best intentions of the world, but if your logic is not making sense, if your actions aren't making sense, if they're actually more destructive than it really is doing, right? If your argument is really more destructive than it is creative, constructive rather, then it doesn't matter how good your intentions are, right? You might have you hear this all the time with a lot of modern day Christians, the idea that, oh, they just want to make sure that people are going to go to heaven, or want to be loved or live their best life or whatever. But then you're turn around and criticize, not just criticize, but downright strip the rights of people who, or strip the freedoms of people who are different, who don't seem to relate to your little holy scriptures, right? So the fact that they claim they have good intentions, but then turn around and do really terrible things to people who they don't agree with, right? I don't agree with your lifestyle. I love you, I just don't love your lifestyle, right? But then you have actions in which you actually deconstruct and take apart their life. Then those intentions don't matter, right? And therefore your logic itself that depends on your good intentions, right, kind of falls short as well. So yeah, that's goodness. It gives a lot to think about, I think.
There's a superficiality to this. Hegel, as far as the inwardness, he says, you know, common sense says that the meaning and fulfillment of these cliches reside in its heart, must surely be present in the hearts of others too, since it reckons of the last word once the innocence of the heart, the purity of the conscience, and such like have been mentioned. And again, we're talking about sort of the phrases of right-thinking humanity within different contexts. You wouldn't talk about the purity of conscience these days because nobody would know what you're talking about. But we have our own cliches in our own culture that we appeal to on the same sort of basis. And then he says, these are ultimate truths to which no exception can be taken, beyond which nothing can be demanded. So they're conversation enders.
Morals.
They say, look, you just have to buy into it. And Hegel says, here's the problem. The best should not remain in the recesses of what is inner. If you can't explain it, you don't actually know it. If you can't explain it, it's probably because it's really fine-spun BS that you bought into and you're trying to get other people to buy into as well. It sounds good, it may actually work in your culture, but it's not real philosophy, is what Hegel's saying. So he says, what we ought to be doing is trying to develop real philosophy. You don't need to do this. Why do this? Why write a philosophy book that's just a bunch of aphorisms? Why write self-help books? Why write leadership books? Why write so many of these things that actually, if you were going to investigate the topic, you would realize there's a lot of work that has to be done here if it's going to be genuine, rigorous philosophy or science. But it's really easy to write a book that makes people feel okay, provided they don't think about it too much, provided they think that they're thinking, but they're not really thinking deeply about it. As a matter of fact, like I put here, all of this can already be found available. It's already there for you. You don't need to reinvent that wheel. Hegel talks about catechisms. Again, we don't, not a term that we really use unless we're doing religious instruction, but we have all sorts of other things. Listicles, great example. We have all these articles, all these blog posts about, what you should be doing in the workplace and how to improve your life and how to unscrew up your relationships and, anything from spirituality to neuroscience to whether we should, try to colonize Mars or not. And you can put it all into a nice, easy to read bullet point form. Well, that's exactly what Hegel's talking about here, as what common sense tries to put over as being philosophy. And again, he doesn't have a problem with common sense as such. He doesn't have a problem with rhetoric. What he has is a problem with this pretending to be genuine philosophy. So he says, when you try to grasp these vague and misleading truths or show that the mind believing in them is also aware of their very opposite, that is when you're doing dialectical philosophy, it gets them all confused. So to common sense, real philosophy, dialectical philosophy, appears to be sophistry. Why? Because the sophist is the person who can argue on both sides and can make the weaker argument appear stronger. And what appears to be weaker to the crowd, to the man of common sense, to the person who's only got this going for them, only has practice in that, the argument that appears stronger to them may not actually be the stronger argument. As a matter of fact, the whole progression of the dialectic that Hegel's charting out in this book is a case where what is the stronger argument for a while turns out to have yet a stronger rival that it's displaced by. And then, the Aufgehebung takes place, the sublation or the transcending of it. Sophistry, like he says, is a slogan used by ordinary common sense against educated reason, just as the expression visionary dreaming sums up once and for all what philosophy means to those who are ignorant of it. Will philosophy be able to convince these people? Probably not. It does have the last laugh in that they don't really know what they're doing, and they're not going to remain within the grand stream of humanity. Quite interesting to read old popular magazines from just half a century ago and to remark on what they took to be common wisdom and how far we have moved away from that, and then do that with stuff later, further back, and now transpose that into our own time and think about 99% of the stuff that we actually read in popular magazines and newspapers, on the internet, that we see on TV, and think, a lot of that is stuff where the very assumptions that are built into it are things that other people are going to, so to speak, call bullshit on later on. Now, what does Hegel conclude with here? He says, in a sense, this common sense attitude, it looks like it's being, very homey and, humble and reaching out to the other, but it's actually kind of anti-human. How so? Because it just appeals to feeling. And by merely appealing to feeling rather than our intellects, it appeals to our intellect in a superficial way, in a way that works so long as you don't push it very far. But when the intellect actually gets some traction and starts, pumping away, it outstrips common sense. To be human, to be genuinely human, means to be able to be elevated out of the realm of merely feeling and mere repetition of catchphrases and cliches. Or even, puttering around, bricolage, as the postmodernists like to say, with that sort of thing. Humanity involves genuine communication. This seems to be communication, but it's not authentic communication. Authentic communication requires that you try to attain agreement with others, not that you take it as a starting point. So he says, it is the nature of humanity to press onward to agreement with others. Not something that you just take as, we already have agreement and we're going to work on the basis of that agreement. Agreement is something that comes down the line. It says human nature only really exists in an achieved community of minds. For us to know what human nature really is, the implication here is for us to do so with others in a community, not of bodies, not of just hanging out next to each other, not of World of Warcraft or playing music together or being in the same university or anything like that, but a community of minds, a community in which people are engaging with each other. They can be engaging in terms of music, gaming, all sorts of other things, cooking even. But what's necessary as an element is something, doesn't have to be called philosophy, but something that plays the role of philosophy. Lacking that, we don't have a genuine community of minds. We have a community of interest, you might say, but not a community of minds. And so this is what we're trying to attain. And in the process, we're going to get to know these others. But that's a story for another time.
That's powerful, man. That reminds me of what we were saying earlier in here, where a lot of science, I'm not sure if it was this one, maybe, no, I think it may have been something else I was reading in terms of the creation of systems thinking and stuff like that versus mechanical, the earlier version of determinism, stuff like that. Where people was like, assume this is correct, right? Assume this is true, and then that means blah 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 blah. So you're already assuming that you're agreeing upon a thing, right? You're assuming that we have come to an agreement, like you upon a certain truth or idea or whatever. When in reality, you should have spent more time, getting to a point where you agree rather than just assuming that this is where we agree upon and then going from there. Because your assumptions, right, the agreements, that thing that that you are assuming that you agree on may itself be extremely wrong. And we see this all the time. Like today, many of us, for instance, would make arguments about crime, right? About crime rates, and say, oh yeah, if you can't bring um, public transport up to this certain area because you create crime rates, right? This is what the stats tell us, but that means you're assuming that we come to agreements on what crime even is, right? And if that crime is actually a significant thing, right? Because and when you delve into this subject of crime, you begin to realize that a lot of this crime in and of itself is made from laws that are themselves wrong, that are themselves discriminatory, or that create the environment for these crimes to even exist, for these crimes to exist, right? Same thing for again, on the topic of freedom, or on the topic of building, like what he says, communities of people that come together for an interest. They assume that they have a shared goal because they came together with that interest, or that they have a shared, kind of reality with that interest. But really, like, you might have an interest with somebody, but you might differ significantly on where you want to go with that, or what you want to do with that, or a number of other things. So another really great point here.
Should anyone ask for a royal road to science, there is no more easygoing way than to rely on sound common sense. And for the rest, in order to keep up with the times and with advances in philosophy, to read reviews of philosophical works, perhaps even to read their prefaces and first paragraphs. For these preliminary pages give the general principles on which everything turns, and the reviews, as well as providing historical accounts, also provide the critical appraisal, which, being a judgment, stands high above the work judged. This common road can be taken in casual dress, but the high sense for the eternal, the holy, the infinite strides along in the robes of a high priest on a road that is from the first no road but has immediate being as its center, the genius of profound original ideas and lofty flashes of inspiration. But just as profundity of this kind still does not reveal the source of essential being, so too these skyrockets of inspiration are not yet the empyrean. True thoughts and scientific insight are only to be won through the labor of the notion.
This goes all the way back to why he's writing this preface, right? I think, and that he's showing that he's using part of this process of creating a philosophical foundation by showing how a preface in itself can be cool and teach you these inspirations like I'm doing. I'm getting these flashes of inspiration, but doesn't really create that foundation in of itself. So if I leave here, right, if I read this phenomenology, this preface, and I'm like, okay, I understand what Hegel's talking about now, right? I actually don't, right? Like, I don't actually know where he's going with this stuff. I don't know what he's building up to. And if I assume I do because I read the preface or the summary or the review, then I haven't actually done what he's practicing here. I'm not doing this process of trying to understand, trying to build, right, this whole foundation, this comprehensive system. So yeah, that was a cool little call out once as well. A little self-aware there.
Only the notion can produce the universality of knowledge, which is neither common vagueness nor the inadequacy of ordinary common sense, but a fully developed, perfected cognition. Not the uncommon universality of a reason whose talents have been ruined by indolence and the conceit of genius, but a truth ripened to its properly matured form so as to be capable of being the property of all self-conscious reason. In section 70, Hegel is continuing his criticisms of common sense, and he's going to draw them to a close, and then we'll take it up again much later in the Phenomenology. He's also engaging in a little bit of play and humor that I want to call your attention to as he's doing this. He talks about the royal road to science, and let's remember, of course, when he's talking about science, he's not just talking about people in lab coats and playing with chemicals, or people putting other people in MRIs, or let alone journals about science, that sort of thing. He's talking about a systematic, developed conception of things that not only takes into account the things that we observe and act upon and understand, but also ourselves, our role in the process, and the sweep of history, human development, and where we fit into that. So, science is not something without a past and a future and opportunities of the present. So the royal road to science. What would the royal road be? Today, we would call it the interstate. Or whatever the equivalent is in other countries. Here in the United States, it's the interstate. These massive highways that were built ultimately, to transport military materials, but they've been used just incredibly for commercial traffic and even leisure traffic. A royal road is one which not necessarily providing a shortcut, but the straightest, clearest, most unimpeded path to where it is that you want to go. So, for example, Freud and On the Interpretation of Dreams, he's going to use that same metaphor of the royal road. Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. If you want to understand the unconscious, it's not as if you can't do it by other means. You can observe the patient, you can do free association, but dreams are the best way into it. So what is Hegel trying to get at here? He's saying that for many people in his contemporary culture, there's a royal road to science, a shorter path, a straighter path, and what does it consist in? He says, sound common sense. Rely on that. And for the rest, because you need some supplement, sound common sense won't give you everything you need. We've already seen some of the problems with it. You can supplement it by reading. What a wonderful world we live in. I mean, think about how this would play out in our contemporary society with respect to education is available everywhere on the internet. Well, yes and no. I mean, this is a great example right here. You can watch videos of this. Ultimately, you probably do need to read and think about Hegel, because you're not going to get it all from watching me up in front of the chalkboard or sitting in my chair, reading from the text. That's not the same thing as you putting in the work to make Hegel your own, to enter into a conversation with him. I'm just sort of an interpreter or translator, or, think of the guy who's introducing you at the party. Hey, I want you to get to know this guy over here. What's the supplementing going on here? So Hegel talks about two things, but we could expand this to include all sorts of other ideas as well. He talks about, if you want to know what's going on in philosophy, if you want to know what's really important, just read reviews on the articles. Read reviews of the work. Gee, don't read Kant's critique of pure reason. Why spend all that time on that? My God, you just destroy your mind trying to figure out what he's saying. Just read somebody's review. That'll tell you the most important stuff in it, and it'll also help you out, because it'll tell you what's right in it and what's wrong in it. You don't have to think that out for yourself. You don't have to figure all that on your own. You've got professionals to handle that sort of thing. Just like, why do you need to worry about what you eat at a restaurant? Just read what the restaurant critics say about the place, what's good on the menu, what's not. Or, you want a more personal thing? Ask your server, ask the chef, what do you recommend tonight? I can't really trust my own taste because it's not developed. I haven't put in the work to do it. I'm going to rely on somebody else's reviews. Well, I mean, you can do that, and I'm not saying that reviews are not useful at all. Oftentimes, reviewers may, if they're very good, call attention to things that the philosopher, if we want to think about movies, the filmmaker or the writer himself or herself didn't actually catch, because when we produce things, there's often a lot more involved than we're consciously aware of. But a review does not substitute for the work, does it? So Hegel goes a little bit further. If you're going to read the work, just read, like, the first couple chapters, or maybe just the preface. You can look at the table of contents. That'll tell you if it's worth reading or not. It'll tell you what it's about. Maybe look at the index. I've seen people do this, actually, in determining whether they should read a book or not, a book of secondary literature. Let me look at the index and see if it cites the people that I'm interested in hearing about. And, okay, there's about 8 citations of Aristotle. That must be a pretty good book. Yep. Oh, you don't know that, right? I mean, this is quite silly. So he says, these preliminary pages give the general principles on which everything turns, and the reviews, as well as providing historical accounts, so you know where things fit in. This is one of the beefs I have with people who always want to say, "Oh, I love Durant's story of philosophy." Yeah, it's a good story. It's not an accurate story in every respect. A lot of these secondary works are, pretty one-sided. They got interested in this over here.
Reminds me of what's going on with civilization, right? People's to this very day of 2022, love the story of civilization created by Rousseau and Hobbes, right? The idea that civilization is a straightforward, pretty much progress, and that we traded freedom for equality or whatever. We traded uh we lived in a brutal life before, and now we're living in this great experience, and that we kind of sacrifice a little bit of freedom for more equality and more time to spend on good things. Like, people buy into that because it sounds like a good story. It makes us feel good about where we've gone, like how far we've come and our accomplishments and things like that. But when you actually delve into the literature or the archaeological data, or think for yourself how evolution works and all this other stuff, you begin to see that, oh wow, we've gained as much as we've lost. Maybe we've lost a little bit more than what we think we've gained, and it's a very complex give and take and all this other stuff. And unfortunately, like, there's so many cases in which we believe in a story because it feels good, right? It sounds good, but it's not actually accurate. So yeah, great call out here.
Here and this over here, and that's what they wrote about, and they totally ignored the other stuff over here that's a little bit more important. Good secondary literature is a bit more balanced than that. Providing critical appraisal, which being a judgment stands high above the work judged. So, when you're reading a major work of philosophy, you don't want to just take it for granted. You don't want to read Descartes and say, well, Descartes, he's an important guy, so he must be right. You do want to form your own judgments about it. But you want to form your own judgments. You don't necessarily just want to import them from whoever happens to be an influential philosopher at the time, or pick some secondary work. There's a lot of great Descartes scholars who are worth reading, but you want to actually assess their judgments on your own, which means you actually need to read the work. You actually need to engage Descartes yourself if you want to be able to appreciate what they're saying about it. I realize that sounds like an awful lot of work. Now, he says something else here that's kind of funny. So he talks about the high sense for and he's got a bunch of things here. He talks about the eternal, the holy, the infinite. Now, again, those were the sort of things that people talked about a lot in Hegel's time. We don't have quite so much talk about those now, but we have our own dots that people are constantly on about, like the singularity. What's going to happen with the singularity? Or neuroscience, or
even the state of consciousness.
The democracy agenda.
Like
that one's pretty much in the tank now after what's happened in the Middle East over the last 10 years. But you get the idea. Liberation, overcoming of this, overcoming of that. It seems like you can't become a philosopher, by the way, and there's a total digression. You can't become a philosopher without coining a few catchphrases. Deconstruction, the other. Everybody talks about the other, right? Externalism, which means a million different things in a million different contexts. But like he's talking about, the high sense for these, big ideas, big catchphrases, strides along the road in the robes of a high priest. Now, notice he's not saying the eternal is walking down the road in the robes of a high priest. He's saying this kind of feeling for it, this kind of, I'm one of the people who does this kind of thing. And boy, if you go to philosophy conferences, you'll see plenty of people like this. Who are, they think that they're really hot stuff because they talk about this particular thing. Or go to a cultural studies conference, or go to, just watch watch TED Talks. A lot of these people are so, full of the eternal, full of neuroscience, full of whatever, that they really think that they've got the thumb on the pulse. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Hegel draws everything to a grinding halt, and he says, that's not a road. This is...
Just real quick, I like how he points out people into neuroscience, for instance, because there are a lot of people, a lot of great, very intelligent scientists and mathematicians and computer scientists and things like that who've done amazing things in their field, but then go way out the way to think that they understand everything about philosophy and that they understand about the nature of the universe because they've studied so much in their field, and they see so many, relations and patterns that are seem to be replicated in the universe and in our minds and things like that. And so they assume, right? They begin to think that their field of study, whether it's neuroscience, computer science, whatever, tells them about the fundamental nature of the universe and human nature and all this other stuff. But like he says here, no, it's just because they feel like it does, because they've studied so much in their field, and the human mind tends to find patterns wherever we see it. And so if you've been studying for so long in this one field, then inevitably your mind will find those same patterns that led you to success in that field. You will find those same patterns in random stuff, even if there's no actual patterns there. Your mind will make up the patterns. Your mind will see random numbers or random things and begin to put things together, and that could be useful, but it's more useful for doing developments in your field. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't have this comprehensive view of science. They don't look at neuroscience and then say, okay, that was cool. Now let's put that aside and now look at biology. Now let's put that aside. Now let's look at computer science. And then let's see the connection between all of these, right? Let's see, people don't very often do that because number one, it's very hard. It's a lot of time that you have to spend on each of these things, but also because it's too hard. I might say, right? And like if you have a lot of success in one field, you get this feeling that you know so much more than everybody else because you do, but just in that one field. But again, it's really hard for us to make that distinguishment, that distinction rather between what we know in our field versus the entire universe and all this other stuff. So yeah, like this is once again another great call out. I really like this episode. Goodness, great stuff here, man.
It isn't actually a road to anything. It's just, like he says, immediate being as its center. It takes the genius of profound original ideas and lofty flashes of inspiration. And he says, that's all real nice, but it's just smoke and mirrors. It's not really giving you essential being. He talks about these skyrockets of inspiration are not yet the empyrean. They're not yet the heavens.
It's not giving what is given.
True thoughts and scientific insight are only to be won through something else that Hegel wants to direct us to. Only this can produce the universality of knowledge, which is neither common vagueness nor the inadequacy of only ordinary common sense, but a fully developed, perfected. Perfected means brought to its fulfillment, cognition. Not the uncommon universality of a reason whose talents have been ruined by indolence and the conceit of genius. Indolence means laziness, laying around, just reading reviews instead of actually doing the work, just watching, simplified videos on things rather than actually reading the text and thinking about them, relying on Spark Notes and Wikipedia, that sort of thing. A truth ripened to its properly matured form so as to be capable of being the property of all self-conscious reason. That's what we're aiming at. What's required for that? One word I've been leaving out here.
Notion.
What Hegel is called, what's translated here as the notion, the Begriff, the concept. We've seen a lot about this. We'll see a lot more about this. But this is something that goes beyond mere common sense, beyond merely reading summaries or schemas of things, and actually goes to, if we want to use Husserl's language, to the things themselves. And doesn't just go to them and look at them, but grapples with them, tries to make them their own, tries to think about what's my role in relation to this, including other things being other persons, including other things being historical eras, being great concepts like freedom or necessity or progress. So that's what Hegel offers instead of this rather seductive high road that turns out not to be a road at all, but really just a cul-de-sac.
Ooh, really just a cul-de-sac. Oh gosh, great way to end it there. And even with the road though too, what's interesting is that in the paving of a road, right, you end up destroying much of the actual natural environment, right? Like with our interstate system, we've destroyed a huge amount of the environment, and not only the environment, but ourselves, right? Our own cities and towns and walkable neighborhoods and places with, diverse peoples. A lot of those towns were destroyed, paved over, just so you can place a big ass highway there, right? That's supposed to be the shortcut. That's supposed to be the easiest way to get from point A to point B. We end up destroying everything in between point A and point B. And so if you look at that from a philosophical standpoint, right? What does that mean for building a sense of philosophy, right? For building a sense of this science of understanding things in our environment, in our universe, if by trying to get from where we are today in terms of our knowledge to where we want to be, we destroy a lot of the points in between, just so that we can get a straight path. All right, I think there's something to be said for that as well. But yeah, another really great section here, and I'm super excited to get into the beyond this preface, but this preface alone has been fantastic too. So yeah, as always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Let me know your thoughts and what you've learned from all this stuff. And yeah, that's it for today. See ya. Bye bye.